I wanted to talk a little bit about the taking of prisoners in war and the difficulties involved with that and the dangers. Did you know that being taken prisoner can actually be one of the most dangerous things in wartime? And there's a variety of different reasons for this. I'm going to give you a few anecdotes, see what springs to mind, and also from the veterans I talked to in the past, a couple of little points about that as well. So let's get started. So we'll talk about World War One. That's my main focus at the moment. And initially in the war, I don't think there was a great deal of animosity. But as it wore on, the problem you would find is that you would see so many of your mates who you've trained with, or even grown up with in the case of POWs battalions and so on, being gunned down. And one of the very common occurrences you find is that you'll have a little German machine gun nest with a couple of Maxim guns in it, and they've been enfilading your whole company, and you might have suffered half casualties. You might have literally had every other man shot down as you've made that assault. And then the moment you reach those guns, suddenly the machine gunners, because they're no good to use at close range, really, you can't swing the thing round. So if you're there with a Mills bomb or a pistol or whatever, a bayonet, immediately throw up their hands and they say, "Kamerad, kamerada, kamerada," or "Mercy, mercy." What do? When you've just seen your mate shot down by these people, they might have killed 10, 20, 30, hundreds even of your friends. And then suddenly they can just throw up their hands. And are you really going to take them prisoner? I'm not convinced you are. And indeed, that's not what happened in World War One. Very often, there'd be no quarter shown to machine gunners because of what they'd done. The feeling of the lads was that, no, you've just murdered a load of my friends. You're going to die too. But the other reason for this, and this is why sometimes you'd lost so many men in the actual assault, the initial attack, you didn't have mopping up companies left. Often, especially on the Somme 1916, the orders were to take the German front-line system, second-line system, third-line section. It was unrealistic. By the time they reached the first line, if they did, they might have lost half their strength. And then what do? The officer will say, well, our orders are to press on to the next line. And so off you go. And sometimes what they would do is just disarm the Germans that they'd taken prisoner, and then they'd send them back to your own lines. You just say, "Raus," and point them in the right direction. Off they go. The problem then is there were many examples of them finding weapons on dead bodies and then firing into the backs of that sparse advancing troop, because we hadn't properly organised this idea of taking the line and then mopping up the prisoners and taking them away in a safe way. Usually, if you had an old veteran there, they were a bit more sensible, and they would either, if they didn't kill the person who'd surrendered, often, if it was thought too dangerous, there was too much ammunition and weapons around, unfortunately, they would very often kill them. They say it's just too dangerous to leave them alive, we've got to carry on, and that was that, really. But sometimes with the old veterans, what they would do, you read accounts of pointing at their belt and saying, "The girdle, Rouse, get your belt off," and make them take off their belts so their trousers are falling down, and make sure obviously equipment's attached to their belts. You take away all their equipment, and then shoo them back. But again, it's still dangerous, isn't it? There's the joke in Dad's Army, isn't there, when they take some German submariners prisoner, I think, and they say, "Cut off their trouser buttons." It might sound like a joke, but actually it's a good idea, because if you're tripping over your trousers, you're a lot less dangerous. And so they would do things like that. They would incapacitate them in some way like that. I mean, I don't know, maybe back in the olden times, you just cut the fingers, the V fingers off an archer, didn't they? So they couldn't arch you anymore. Or back what they used to do in Bible times is chop the thumbs off so you couldn't carry a sword anymore. It sounds a bit gory, but it's better than being bayoneted to death, isn't it? Maybe they should have done a bit more of that. I don't know. Cut the trigger finger off. Whatever. I don't know. But that's just a generalism. It's difficult to take prisoners, and you need specialised mopping up teams, and that didn't come on the Somme. So there was one example I heard. This is the British. I presume this is in the southern part of the Somme offensive in July, where we did make considerable progress along with the French down there near the River Somme. Up in the north, we made none really, just massive casualties. In the south, a couple of our lads got to the German line. There's an old German there just looking bewildered, absolutely terrified, and not knowing what to do. And one of this lad, obviously, this man, young man, knew what he was doing. He said to the German, he said, "Take your belt off," and gestured for him to take it off because it still had a bayonet attached. And he took that off him. I think he also wanted the Gottman's belt buckle as a souvenir, but that's another story. He's like, "Take your hat off, take this up, that, and the other off." And he was going to send him back. His mate appears and says, "It's all right, Harry. I'll take care of him for you." And is just going to run him through with his bayonet, because that's what the other man was going to do. But the first chap says, "Oh, come on, he's an old man. He's terrified. We can't just kill him." And that one was spared. However, let's flip this around. During the Kaiserschlacht, Operation Michael of April 1918, where the Germans launched their last, ultimately failed roll of the dice, we have Reginald Crowley from West Wyalong in Australia, from the Fighting Crowleys that I talked about before. He goes to take a German officer prisoner who's been badly wounded. He's lying on the ground and he's pleading, "Camarada, camarada," this kind of thing. Reg is going to bayonet him, to be fair. He's just about to. And then some instinct, a moment of compassion, whatever, he withdraws. He doesn't. He's going to take him prisoner. Whereupon the officer pulls out a pistol and shoots Reg twice in the stomach. So that's the flip side, isn't it? He got killed for mercy. And that's not a mercy killing. He was killed for his mercy. Of course, then his mates set upon the German. I think they basically beat him to death, or bashed him to death, as they say in Australia. It's their word for bludgeon. So that's the flip side of it. We have other examples. The Canadians in World War I gained a reputation for not taking prisoners. And that was for a number of reasons, perhaps. There was certainly the rumour going round, very strong rumour, of a crucified Canadian. And who knows, it is possible that the Germans may have crucified someone. He might have been blown up into a tree by the force of a shell, and it looked like he'd deliberately been hung there. Or we know in the Second World War there are plenty of examples of Germans hanging up dead bodies to scare off the enemy. So maybe he was hung there after his death. We just don't know. But there was a strong rumour going around that the Germans had crucified a Canadian. And so that may have made them more steely. Also, the Canadians had a reputation of being used quite a lot in frontline attacks, early assaults. If you're the ones doing the attacking, you're the ones seeing most of your mates falling, gradually you develop a hardness. And so it would actually appeal, maybe appeal is the wrong word, there was a complaint made to the International Red Cross by the Germans that the Canadians were not taking prisoners, and they saw it as a war crime. It didn't get very far. Overall in the war, the Canadians took 42,000 prisoners of war, so they certainly took them, but we can actually find numerous. Out of, I think, around 600 veterans, Canadian veterans, who gave their accounts of the war, we have several dozen who talked about, and this was the 1960s, so it's much later. They're not worried about prosecution and things like this. Much later, several dozen of them talked about murdering prisoners, so that certainly did happen. One example of one Canadian, there was a line of Germans surrendering. He was pretending to be friendly, the Canadian soldier, and he slipped a Mills bomb into a German's pocket and then snuck off quickly. And of course, you can imagine what happened, the carnage that wreaked. So they would do things like that. And there were certainly accounts, I remember one saying to them, not taking any prisoners today, they just eat our rations. And even commanders, not high-up commanders, there are no official army commanders or anything with, the Canadian Corps commanders, but the ones lower down, battalion commanders, platoon commanders, very often they told, no prisoners today. An example was the Battle of Mont-Saint-Quentin, if I pronounce that right, which was Monash's great victory. That was at the end of August 1918, which was forcing the Germans back to the Hindenburg line. He was under Rawlinson's Fourth Army. He did a wonderful move. He tried to cross the Somme, too marshy, so they went round, used the bridge much further up in our sector, and then came across and basically flanked the Germans there, took them off the hill. And there are examples there of once Germans had pushed through, so not the Germans, once the Monash's Australians, we're talking about now, Monash's Australians, once they pushed through and they were into open country, there was this sort of either a road or a bridge or an aqueduct or there was a raised obstacle that went on for miles. One officer was out on reconnaissance. He walked through a little culvert sort of underneath this big raised wall, and he came across about 16 Germans just there. And now we're seeing the dispirited nature of the Germans' fighting spirit. He immediately whips out his revolver. He shoots 2 of them, and the rest throw up their hands. So one reconnaissance officer takes about 14 prisoners, just like that. That happened there. A little bit later, at Le Quesnoy, which is a fortified medieval town just on the Belgian border. It's in France, north of France, but it's just on the Belgian border. That was taken by New Zealand troops, and it was like a medieval siege. You had to make siege ladders and all the rest of all these primitive weapons and things. It's a remarkable little battle. But there, what the New Zealand troops found, they were incredibly worried because, or the Germans, it appears, were incredibly worried. They knew they'd inflicted grievous losses on these New Zealand troops. They had to cross a moat and put up siege ladders, all under machine gun fire. They'd suffered terrible casualties. And so what we know from that one is that once the siege ladders were up, the Germans basically observed sort of ancient medieval chivalry almost, in that they accepted, now we've been beaten, we've put up a bit of a fight, here's where we surrender honourably and we're not hopefully massacred. And so what they had done, they left a Vickers gun right at the top of the siege ladder, and they all put down their weapons. And so 2 officers climbed the siege ladder, jumped onto the ramparts with their pistols out, expecting probably to get shot. Instead, they find a nice loaded, Vickers or Maxim, they're all very similar, German machine gun anyway there, that they're able to cover all the Germans with, and they all surrendered, and there was no need for any mass killing. So that was come the end where there were many incidents actually of mass surrenders there. Here's another example. Unfortunately, I forget the specifics of it, but I believe it was World War One. By the time we'd adopted convoys, so later on in the war, and there was a submarine, or a U-boat, I guess we ought to say, a German U-boat, that was attacking a convoy. And a destroyer had come out and had spotted it, and it fired upon it, and it forced the U-boat to the surface, and its crew were coming out. And as its crew were coming out, someone on the destroyer was just machine gunning them all in the sea. But then another ship appeared on the scene, and they immediately stopped because they didn't want anyone to know what they'd done. This may have been retaliation for similar instances of U-boat commanders sinking lifeboats. A notable example is when a British hospital ship was sunk. The U-boat commander knew he'd committed a war crime, and he thought, rather than holding my hands up and apologising, he thought far better we'd cover it up. And so him and just 2 of his trusted officers went on the top, the U-boat surfaced. They machine gunned the lifeboats. But one lifeboat got away, and eventually, miraculously, the story came out. And amazingly, that U-boat commander basically got away scot-free. He received very little time in jail after the war. He should have been executed for what he did, but in the spirit of the times and stuff and reconciliation, he got away with that one. But going back to the British one, so we stopped machine gunning when someone else was able to see. The commander of the U-boat had survived, and I forget his name, unfortunately, probably became a lieutenant. He actually made a complaint, and this is hilarious. He made a complaint that reached the British government saying, you have committed a war crime by machine gunning my crew. The reply of the British government was, Her Majesty's government does not recognise war crimes to be a crime during times of war. That's brilliant. It's like something from Yes Minister, isn't it? Her Majesty's government does not recognise war crimes. The crime of war crime during the time of war. But anyway, so nothing happened there, of course. Operation Compass, World War II, that's the end of December 1940 to February 41. 133,000 Italians surrendered there in Libya to General O'Connor's men. Tiny British force, remarkable victory. Another interesting example, we assume the Japanese would have been the worst of this, and indeed the way they looked after prisoners, that's probably the wrong term to use. The way they imprisoned prisoners was barbaric, evil, and I don't think they were signed up to any of the relevant conventions, but had they been, they certainly would have been criminal in their behaviour. But we know famously Churchill's one of his biggest blunders after Gallipoli, sending out the Repulse and the Prince of Wales to stop the landings in Malaysia or Malaya, Singapore. When they went out, there were rumours at the time that the Japanese, after they torpedoed the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, that they were deliberately shooting up lifeboats, coming down low and shooting the sea, machine gunning survivors. I've listened to quite a few veterans' accounts now. No reports of that at all. In fact, I did hear of some saying, actually, one of the Japanese saluted us because we put up a brave fight. So, maybe that was true, maybe that wasn't. And yes, I was going to move on to the few veterans that I've encountered. I've only encountered, well, at least I've probably counted many, but I've only talked to a couple. One of them was a veteran from the 8th Army, Montgomery's 8th Army in the North Africa. We never talked about prisoners, unfortunately, so I can't talk about that. The other one, though, was interesting. He was part of 6th Airborne, Airborne Division, one of the units that was sent. He was initially actually a glider pilot, and then he transferred to be a soldier, because apparently you got better money being a glider soldier rather than being the actual pilot, which kind of seems funny, doesn't it? But that was the case. That's what he told me. He transferred. He was part of taking of the Merville Battery, which was something we did on the 6th of June early on, because it covered Sword Beach and it was dangerous. And so his unit went to attack Merville Battery. I didn't talk about prisoners there, but at that time it was in the news that a British soldier was being prosecuted and sent to military prison because he'd made a mistake having a body camera on when he murdered a wounded Taliban soldier. He said, "Shuffle off this mortal coil, you," such and such, and then shot him, which is a nice quote, I believe, from Hamlet. It's only Shakespeare. But yeah, I said, "What did you think of that?" And he basically laughed at me and he said, "Oh, we shot prisoners all the time. It was so casual." And he must have served before that in maybe in the Iraqi uprising or maybe the invasion of Syria, because he was talking about fighting against Arabs. And he told me a tale of when there were 2 Arab enemy soldiers who we had taken prisoner. We just couldn't be bothered to look after them, so we just marched them down to a nearby wadi and shot them both. He told me that quite happily. I mean, he dude was probably nearly 100, so so that was my own experience of interviewing anyone about that. I'm sure there are many examples, if you listen to veterans' accounts, of taking vast numbers of prisoners, especially towards the end of World War One. Back on the Hindenburg Line, after it was breached, many examples of one soldier reaching the line, vastly outnumbered. I should have said, I talked about the Australians at Mount St Quentin. Okay, just nipping back to that, Mount St Quentin, we said the end of August, it was meant to be, one division was doing the main attack. And there are 4 battalions per brigade. One brigade potentially about 1,000 men. One of those brigades, and this was typical for all of the division, one of the brigades had little over 1,000 men. So they were something like quarter strength. And so the Germans were not outnumbered by Aussies. They greatly outnumbered the Aussies. And yet they again, on that occasion, did surrender in large numbers after the Aussies had pushed forward and had breached their line. And so ultimately, when it came to being taken prisoner, it was a risky business, depended who you got, it entirely depended. And of course, it's interesting that all the accounts only came out much later, because when you go back home and you might only be 20 or in your early 20s, do you want everyone to know that you cold-bloodedly murdered people? You don't. So it wasn't something that people talked about until much later. I believe General Patton, murdered. I think he murdered some bandits, as I recall, in the Pascovia raid. I can't quite remember now. And I think he also committed murder in the First World War, where he was serving. But that's what I'm trying to research. I might need to get a biography of Patton. I think Peter Hart does a good one, so I'll have to look up that. Yeah, wraps it up. Thanks for listening.